100 Forgotten Things from 1960s America. A breeze of memory as light as the wind, as sweet as vanilla ice cream, melting under a summer sun. There were years when the world seemed to walk slower. 1960 began like that with tranquil mornings when the alarm wasn't the jarring ring of a smartphone, but the chirping of birds on the porch eaves, the soft crackle of a radio tuning in, and the warm scent of coffee percolating in an old aluminum pot slipping quietly through the kitchens of America. At the breakfast table, Dad unfolded the newspaper. Mom wrapped sandwiches for the kids. And those children, dressed in neat uniforms and carrying tin lunchboxes stamped with Roy Rogers or Barbie, got ready to board the familiar yellow school bus that stopped outside the house at precisely 7:15 each morning. The day didn't begin in a rush. It began in a rhythm you could measure by the heartbeat of routine. The streets were quieter then. Chevy Impalas, Pontiac, Catalinas, and Ford Galaxies rolled gently down the roads as if they too were listening to the morning news updates on President Kennedy on the space race, or maybe just a small story from a town no one had ever heard of, all delivered in the steady, unhurried voice of the local radio host. The radio was the heart of every home. Before color television made its way into every living room, the radio was where Mom got the weather. Dad followed the war, and kids sang along to Elvis or Connie Francis. Not every household had a TV. And when the neighbor got one in color, every child on the block crowded in, sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide, as if witnessing magic. On June afternoons, the entire neighborhood smelled like freshly cut grass and backyard barbecue. The hum of push lawn mowers sang in harmony with the summer air. Kids sprawled across the sunlit yards, playing marbles, jump rope, or hide and seek. Nobody wore watches. They just knew to head home when the streetlights flickered on. No one used the word freedom to describe those days, yet everything felt free. A simple lunch of sandwiches and juice. Afternoons spent twirling on chrome bar stools in soda shops, sipping cherry Coke. Evenings gathered around a black and white television, the whole family watching The Ed Sullivan Show, or I Dream of Jeannie, with laughter and quiet contentment. Telephones hung on the wall with curled cords, and if you dialed the wrong last digit, you had to start all over again. Long-distance calls were measured in pennies per minute, and if your neighbor accidentally picked up the shared party line, well, you'd hang up and try again later. The backyard was paradise. Children dug for buried treasure beneath flower beds, built forts from old sheets, and imagined themselves as astronauts awaiting launch. Because in 1961, when Alan Shepard broke through the atmosphere, America learned that anything was possible. And that feeling, that quiet certainty that anything could happen, crept into every corner of daily life. From the films screened in small-town theaters for less than $1, to family picnics at state parks with coolers full of sandwiches and Beach Boys songs drifting from the car cassette deck. Mothers cooked by instinct. There were no digital scales or online recipes, just a heaping spoonful, a pinch of salt, guided by memory, and a Kenmore oven that breathed out the scent of pies every weekend. Children set the table, wiped it clean, and washed dishes not out of obligation, but because that's just what people did for each other. In school, teachers were always sir or ma'am. Students stood when their names were called. If you made a mistake, you erased it or simply started over. Nothing moved fast, but everything felt solid. You didn't just learn to add or multiply. You learned to stand up straight to tell the truth and to treat others with decency. Holidays were sacred moments. Halloween didn't come from big box stores. Kids made costumes from tablecloths, cardboard boxes, and masks cut from cereal boxes. Christmas lights weren't digital or blinking. They were glass bulbs tucked away in newspaper each January and lovingly wiped clean by hand the next December. When the tree was raised in the living room, strung with popcorn garlands and wrapped gifts in last year's paper, the whole house turned magical. When a neighbor had a baby, no one sent gifts from Amazon. They showed up at the door with casseroles still warm and a borrowed cradle from their eldest. The mother rested for a week. The father handed out cigars. There was no registry because everyone knew each other, understood each other, and lived for one another. On Sunday mornings, gospel music drifted from the radio. The scent of bacon mingled with the gentle clink of a coffee spoon and the soft rustle of the newspaper. These were days when the world paused just long enough for the human heart to breathe. Summer evenings stretched to 8 p.m., the last golden light painting maple branches red. Children stayed outside because the sun hadn't gone to bed, and adults didn't rush them because they knew some moments, if missed, could never be recaptured. Everyone knew their neighbors. If you needed pliers, you knocked next door. If you were going away for a few days, you handed the key to Mr. Jenkins so he could feed the cat. And when you came back, a warm apple pie would already be waiting on your kitchen counter. No cameras, no passwords, just trust exchanged like the air we breathed. Children climbed trees with bare hands, splashed through creeks with bare feet, and wore nothing on their knees except scrapes. They had no after-school schedules, no reminder apps. They measured time by the sound of the school bell, the smell of popcorn from the corner store, or the distant chime of the ice cream truck. If you caught a cold, Mom pressed her hand to your forehead, fetched syrup from the cabinet, and tucked the blanket up to your chin. No health trackers, no Google searches, and yet somehow you felt better because she was there. Most families had one car, one television, and one bathroom, and somehow that was enough. The oldest brother watched the clock, the youngest waited patiently, and Mom, always the first to rise, made sure she didn't disturb anyone. The wooden cabinet in the living room wasn't just for books. On top were old letters in a tin box, a few black and white photos, and a faded wedding card in a frame. Every object had a story. Nothing was just picked up. Everything carried time, fingerprints, and meaning. In small towns, there was always a store that sold electronics where you could pick up a transistor radio, a Kodak camera, or a Zenith television. But more than that, it was a place where you'd walk in, greet Earl behind the counter, ask how his wife was doing after surgery before asking the price of the record player. At the barber shop, the click of scissors blended with talk of politics, local baseball scores, and how Johnny down the block just got into tech school. No one looked up reviews. You didn't need Yelp. You needed Lou, who'd been cutting your family's hair for 3 generations and still charged $2 a visit. Cars back then. Fords, Dodges, Plymouths had no seatbelts, no airbags. And yet somehow, everyone made it through the summer. Kids sat in the way back, the wind whipping through open windows. Mom passed sandwiches from the cooler. Dad yelled over the radio, "Who wants orange juice?" as the tires hummed along endless roads. You could fill the tank, buy a bag of candy, and still have enough change for a movie, all with a few coins. No need to reserve online. No apps You showed up, stood in line, bought your ticket, and took a seat beside strangers in the dark, where the whole town laughed, gasped, and cried together. At the laundromat, your grandmother met old friends. They sat on wooden benches, knitting swapping stories while the washers spun. No one hurried. No one watched the clock. White clothes weren't just white because of detergent. They were white because someone waited for them. And on summer nights, when the TV signed off at midnight, the family knew it was time for bed. The screen went to static snow, the national anthem played, and the house sank into quiet. There was no, "Are you still watching?" prompt from Netflix. Only a father's voice from the next room. "Turn it off now. You've got school in the morning." There was a time when dreams didn't glow from a touch screen. They glowed from the bedroom ceiling, where kids stared up at glow in the dark stars, taped to plaster with school glue, and whispered to each other, "One day, we'll fly to the moon." And then, in 1969, it happened. That night, everyone sat crowded around the TV. No one needed high definition, no surround sound, just the grainy black and white image of Neil Armstrong stepping down the ladder, his voice crackling through the static. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. All across America, people held their breath. Some cried, some said nothing, only squeezed each other's hands. No one spoke, but everyone understood we were witnessing forever. From that moment, kids' bicycles were no longer just bicycles, they were spacecraft. Every dusty dirt road was Mars, every puddle a crater, every tree branch an antenna beaming messages from the imaginary space station. While out there, mankind reached for the skies back home. In modest kitchens and shag-carpeted living rooms, Americans held on to simpler things. A chrome blender on the countertop, a waffle iron made of solid steel, and the very first microwave eyed with suspicion like something brought back from outer space. On autumn evenings, when the breeze crept through the windows and dry leaves piled up in the backyard, families gathered under blankets in the living room, sipping hot cocoa, watching shows like The Andy Griffith Show or Leave It to Beaver. The jokes were gentle, the stories simple, and somehow you didn't need subtitles to understand warmth. A letter from a soldier stationed in Vietnam might take 3 weeks to arrive, but when Dad read it aloud, Mom clutched a handkerchief and the youngest child curled into Grandma's side. Not every American supported the war, but every American knew what it meant to worry about someone far away where no phone could reach. The bakery near the school still sold long loaves of rye bread, sprinkled with caraway seeds, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The shopkeeper, widowed since 1944, always slipped a small extra bun into the bag for any child who came in to buy bread for their mother. "Take this home for your baby sister," she'd whisper, eyes glistening like the steam from her oven. In the library, students still scribbled notes by hand on scrap paper, folded page corners, and whispered to the librarian about the new book that just came in that everyone was waiting to check out. No one needed the internet because there, under the filtered sunlight, among the smell of old paper and ink, an entire world opened itself page by quiet page. The shoe repair shop on the corner still used an old leather stitching machine, Mr. Junger. Walt had mended the cracked soles of nearly every family in town. He didn't advertise, just a hand-painted sign in the window. "Keep the old. Remember yourself." and everyone who stepped inside walked a little slower. At the post office, the young clerk carefully affixed stamps by hand. She never knew which envelopes held a first love letter, which carried bad news, or which ones were the last memory of someone who'd never get to write again. When grown-ups spoke of the future, they said hope like it was a serious word. They didn't dream of flying cars or robots. They dreamed of getting their kids into college, of buying a new washing machine that saved water, of maybe, just maybe, paying off the bank loan by 1975. And then as night came, and the streetlights cast their amber glow on the pavement, the radio still played softly near the windowsill. A news bulletin, a ballad by Simon and Garfunkel, or a gentle Patsy Cline tune that made the whole block go still for a moment. The 1960s weren't just a decade, they were a state of heart. At some point, all of America seemed to awaken no longer the wide-eyed child of the post-war era, but not yet the hardened adult of the decades to come. And youth, they chose to speak. In high school, hallways, long hair began to appear. Boys no longer wore their father's crew cuts. They let their bangs fall slightly messy, strumming guitars between classes. Girls wore shorter skirts, lipstick in muted choral tones, and read Sylvia Plath during biology. Something was shifting. No one could name it, but everyone felt it. Across corridors that smelled of fresh ink and echoed with predictable bells, glances were exchanged. Not to ask about homework, but as if to ask, do you feel it too? Do you sense the world is shaking? And they found each other in cafes near libraries, in bedrooms with "Make Love Not War" posters taped to the wall in city parks late at night, sharing Marlboros and promises. We'll live differently. There were Sundays without church spent instead at protests. Hand-painted signs, footsteps unafraid, and voices singing from deep within. Blowing in the wind, where have all the flowers gone? Not everyone agreed, not everyone approved, but everyone knew the silence of the youth had ended. Yet in another corner of America, in towns with just one bookstore and 2 gas stations, children still played tag behind the school, still got scolded for not washing their hands before dinner, still dreamed of becoming doctors, teachers, or astronauts. They carried no signs, but they too were growing in a world no longer like the one their parents had grown up in. The Super 8 camera came to every family party. The footage was short silent, but it captured laughter, awkward dancing, and birthday cakes blown out in a single breath. Years later, when watched again, you didn't just see images, you heard time itself. The record store became a sanctuary. You could stand for hours among the vinyl sleeves, listening to samples fingering the covers of Bob Dylan, The Supremes, or Janis Joplin. Placing the needle was a ritual. You sat down, closed your eyes, let the music carry you far, far away. At the bus stop, a boy with a canvas backpack, worn denim jacket, and tousled hair clutched a small notebook. He had no plan, only a direction west. Someone asked, "Where you headed?" He smiled. "I don't know, but I think I need to go." That was America in the 60s, a place where every question began with why, and every road was open for those brave enough to take the first step. But through all that change, what kept people grounded were the little things: a warm apple pie cooling on the windowsill, a loyal dog waiting on the porch, and a grandmother's voice soft as the wind. No matter how the world changes, you must still live kindly. And perhaps that's why, of all the revolutions of that era, what lingers most in memory is not the slogans or the smoke or the marches, but the feel of that first summer evening, your hand in someone else's beneath the porch light, your lips trembling from the first true flutter of the heart. By the end of the 60s, amid the noise outside home, remained the only place where no one asked you to choose a side. It was where you came back to after long days, where dinner waited with roasted meat, mashed potatoes, and peanut butter toast. No speeches, no causes, just one sentence. Welcome home. The living room belonged to everyone. On the coffee table, Life magazine Reader's Digest, a dusty vase of plastic flowers, and the TV remote, which truthfully was your older brother turning the dial. The television was the hearth of the evening. Shows like Bonanza Gilligan's Island or The Carol Burnett Show made the whole family laugh, not because they were brilliant, but because they were sweet, simple, and safe. In the desk drawer, there was always a fountain pen, navy blue, silver cap, the nib slightly tilted from years of use. Each stroke trembled just a little, leaving a faded mark at the beginning of every line, like a whispered greeting. First love letters, school essays about the American dream, all written by hand in ink from the heart. In the leather school satchel with brass buckles, students carried notebooks, a dog-eared novel smuggled into math class, and a metal lunchbox featuring Hop-Along Cassidy Superman or Howdy Doody. Inside, Mom had packed a bologna sandwich, an apple, and sometimes a few wax-wrapped cookies, a quiet surprise never announced. Libraries were places where people whispered like speaking to their own thoughts. Wooden floors creaked beneath careful steps. Light poured through frosted windows onto worn fabric chairs. And the scent of old books of paper ink and time moved into your chest like a fragrance that never faded. Checkout cards were thick and stamped by hand. No barcodes, no QR scans. Each book carried the traces of those who had read it before a penciled note in the margin, a slight fold on a corner, or a forgotten pressed flower sleeping between two chapters. The Kodak camera, black 35mm, was the most precious object in the house. No one wasted a shot. Each photo was composed with care because there were only 24 exposures per roll. When the pictures were finally developed, everyone gathered around the kitchen table, laughing at squinting eyes, crooked smiles, and that one candid of Mom before she fixed her hair. The photos were pasted into albums with homemade glue. Each page hand-labeled Christmas 1964, Trip to Lake Michigan, Dad's 50th birthday. And as the years passed, the pictures didn't fade, they aged, and somehow became more alive. On sidewalks, children played marbles, drew hopscotch with chalk, and waged imaginary wars with fallen branches. They didn't need instruction manuals or fancy toys, just a few ideas, a friend, and a whole afternoon with no one calling them back inside. The sound of the ice cream truck, just one long note from far off, could still stop the whole neighborhood. Kids would scramble for coins, bare feet slapping the hot pavement, shouting their orders with sticky fingers and wide-eyed joy. At the corner store, there were no electronic registers. You bought a soda, a lollipop, a newspaper, and the shopkeeper jotted your tab down in pencil. Mom came by to settle up on Saturday. No one reminded her. No one had to. Trust was a form of currency that didn't require a signature. The sewing kit always had an old pair of scissors, red thread, a bent needle, and that missing shirt button from last month. Mom didn't buy new shirts. She stitched the old ones. Dad didn't replace the drill. He fixed the handle. And if something truly couldn't be mended, the family sat down together and told the story of when it still worked. Saturday flea markets sold everything: used records, one-wheeled bikes, outdated cookbooks. Grandpa's old fedora, a floral dress still faintly scented with vintage perfume. No one went there to get rich. They went to find some piece of themselves they'd forgotten they'd lost. On the corner, there was still a red payphone, big buttons, heavy receiver. You dropped in a dime dialed, and when someone picked up, you smiled like you just won the lottery. Each call was short, but never meaningless. The wooden wall clock ticked endlessly like the heartbeat of the house. You heard it at 2 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. And somehow, that ticking said, everything is fine. Everything is still moving forward. There was a moment on the last night of 1969 when the clock struck 12 and all of America seemed to take a deep breath, not to celebrate, but to hold on to something that had just slipped from its hands, soft, fragile, nameless. Outside, a thin layer of snow blanketed rooftops. From someone's living room radio, Auld Lang Syne drifted faintly. Mom rested her head on Dad's shoulder. The youngest leaned against Grandma's knee, and everyone thought, but no one said this year was different. The 1960s closed like a handwritten letter never sent. Inside it, the dream of reaching the moon, the awkward kiss under the maple tree, the tears shed on distant battlefields, and the overcooked stew no one complained about because no one wanted to hurt Mom's feelings. It was an era where you could step outside with 50 cents and come home with an ice cream cone, a paperback novel, a tune stuck in your head, and a reason to smile. An era when letters took a week to arrive, but when they did, you read them again and again, then folded them carefully, as if protecting a piece of your own soul. A time when children didn't ask, "What's the Wi-Fi password?" but instead, "Mom, can we ride our bikes to the lake this afternoon?" A time when hugs weren't posted online, but lasted long enough for the other heart to feel it. A time when the whole family looked at the same screen, watched the same show, and laughed with the same breath. No headphones, no notifications, just being there. You could open a closet and still smell the perfume clinging to Mom's handmade sweater. Up in the attic, an old shoebox held yellowed letters, black and white photos, and a yearbook with a handwritten note. "Don't forget me." Okay. And really, no one ever forgets. They just tuck it away and remember in silence. A whole decade passed in the laughter from park swings, the lullabies from old radios, the shouts of Dad, "My chain came off on dusty roads." These things were never in the headlines, never in textbooks, never in government reports. But it was these things that made America. When you grow old, you won't remember everything you learned, every place you went, every task you completed. But you will remember the feel of your mother's hand on your way to school in the fog, the scent of barbecue drifting through a fall afternoon, the warmth of the oven light when Dad came home late, and the words whispered gently, "Everything's going to be okay, sweetheart." The 1960s passed just like that, not loud, not rushed. They arrived like background music and left like the last light of day, ungraspable, but forever warming whenever remembered. And now, in a world where everything can be fast-forwarded, searched, and summarized, we just wish we could rewind. To sit once more on the front porch with a half-melted popsicle sunlight on our cheeks and the quiet certainty that just one slow afternoon could be enough for an entire lifetime. Maybe we haven't really lost those days. Maybe they're still waiting in a melody from the past in a quiet afternoon, or in a memory whispered softly when the world slows down just enough for us to hear our hearts say, everything used to be so beautiful.